just as an overview, the compost that we make is very easy to manufacture because it does not need to be finished, and because it is not being incorporated into the soil. And so it essentially resembles a compost mulch material. So we're not looking for the wood chips to be broken down, the leaf to be broken down. We're looking for it to be actually unbroken down, and the objective is to take the materials to feed the soil microbiology. So we're taking a very young compost and mixing it out into the field. The temperatures we maintain in the pile are low. We seek to have it down around 120, so that encourages the fungal organisms that we're seeking in the field. And we use a lot of wood chip in the pile in order to not have to turn it. It keeps it aerated. It's down our way, there's not much softwood. We do use a lot of sawdust from a coffin maker in town, which is all softwood. So it's really a combination of deciduous wood chip and a proportion of softwood sawdust. The temperatures don't meet certification. That is very true. And let me just hit that because it's a juicy subject, you know. So yes, the compost regulate. So we're not certified because of things like that. We previously were certified before the federal program came in, and so we were active in NOFA, and we were active with the certification committee. And under that system, it was very sensible. You know, the farmers set their own regulation, and we all followed a regulation that the farmers all agreed to. And you know, so I loved organic, and I loved working with my other growers to come up with a reasonable standard. But at the time, back then, which is probably 25 years ago now, the industrial interests needed to slander organic agriculture. I'm going to spend a few minutes because it's such a juicy subject. Normally I don't talk about this much. But essentially, what was going on is, you know, organic was growing, it was pre-fed, and there needed to be a slander campaign from industrial interests. So they brewed up the microbe danger, the fear of germs, germ phobia, and they came on with this media blitz through these think tanks and stuff about how organic farmers use manure. And of course, all the conventional farms use manure too, but they didn't mention that part. And so there came on this steady slander, germ phobia, microbe scenario that has carried through since then. And so when the federal program came out, they came in with a very irrational, germ-phobic composting regulation. And so the reason that I point out irrational is that there has never been a case of food poisoning, as far as I know. You know, obviously we looked into it at the time, 20 years ago, but nobody has ever been poisoned by a 120-degree compost pile pre-plant application to a field in the history of the world. So, you know, we're discussing an unwarranted activity because they had no evidence of danger. What they had, they claimed, was laboratory tests that said that E. coli could survive in a laboratory under however many days, you know, but then they added a bunch of days just to be safe. And so the science was incredibly weak, and there was no actual risk in place in our society. So it was more about damaging our ability to produce organic crops, because the compost regulations have severely damaged the ability of organic farmers to use compost in their production systems. And the use of compost in the organic production system is the heart, soul, digestive tract, everything about the organic method. That's why it's called the organic method. And so it was a very unfortunate condition, and unfortunately it has built up into a fervor now of germ phobia. And so what basically it looks like to us is that we are doing, and everything I'm going to talk about today is about enhancing biological activity in the soil. enhancing biological activity on the leaf. We are trying to maximize as much life force as possible in the field all the time. That is how you grow a crop that doesn't require pesticides and a crop that is nutrient balanced with an appropriate nutrient, mineral, amino acid, vitamin profile, okay, not unbalanced crop growth. That horrifies germ-phobic people. You know, because germ-phobic people want everything sterilized, which is against everything that we're doing. Okay?
So what's happening worse is now FDA with the food laws coming in.
Yeah, it only is building up. This.
It's getting worse.
So, for instance, and I imagine in the future there's going to be a raw vegetable movement, just like there's the raw milk movement, because now, of course, the vegetables from California Organic are all being sterilized, and they lack the proper biology on the leaf surfaces for your digestive tract and for full digestion. And so there is a movement towards sterilization, even in organic agriculture. So all those conditions are, I just wanted to point out that, you know, we're working with active biological systems, and there's a huge movement against that. However, it is the key to success in terms of the elephant in the closet is pesticide poisoning of the population, okay? Food Safety Modernization Act, not a shred. I mean, what is everybody dying of? Cancer, you know? Not a shred of pesticide safety, you know, modernization in there. And instead, the reverse, which is classic of government. So it is a reversal of what needs to be going on. We are in the business of keeping people healthy. So I mentioned quickly, and I'm just going to move it over to nutrition quickly, but not only is the pesticide the danger, but the nutrient imbalance is a very serious problem. The nutrient imbalance, I touched it quickly from use of tillage implements. The way it elevates that nitrogen potassium level is very damaging to human health. Crops need, as I was saying, steady, regular nutrient release in an organic form from the biological life of the soil. And what that leads to in a crop is a proper mineral profile spectrum. But greater than that is the fact that if the trace elements and the proper minerals are not getting into the plant, everything becomes skewed in the plant. And the amino acid profile will not be correct, your vitamin levels will not be correct. And so if you're not getting a steady release of nutrients, the plant becomes weak and is not beneficial for human consumption or animal consumption. So it all goes hand in hand. You know, it's not just pesticides, because there is serious nitrogen poisoning in the population. Nitrogen being so over-applied in the environment, it agitates the humans. They are nervous from eating so much nitrogen. The nitrogen manufacturing, I was just reading a great book, if you want to get into soils, is Ray Wheel's Nature and Properties of Soils, big college textbook, great coverage. In that, he discusses how much nitrogen is being synthesized from the air in the fertilizer factories and other nitrogen sources. It exceeds the entire world's biological ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen in the soil. You know, the entire surface of the earth is, the microbes are fixing the nitrogen from the air for plant growth, the traditional way the biology moves nitrogen into the plant growth. Every year, chemical nitrogen manufacturing exceeds the level of biological nitrogen fixation on the entire Earth's surface. And then all of that fixed nitrogen is slathered onto the Earth's surface. It pollutes the groundwater, nitrous oxide, just massive greenhouse gas, you know, way worse than carbon dioxides. So, you know, there's this huge nitrogen problem. So I just want to point that out, that, you know, we're after health, vitality, and it all goes hand in hand. And of course, there is massive regulation against doing what is healthful. And this was a classic because I had, on a small farm, I have only limited area for compost manufacturing, and I had several windrows all lined up, ready to go, but I needed space for the one more windrow. And of course, I piled it over here right next to all my laundry with some cattle manure coming in there. And I got into huge trouble. Huge trouble with that one. That was a huge mistake. So I won't do that ever again. But you can see that the minerals, we use gypsum, sea salt, talc, and some others which I'll discuss. They all are mixed into the composting system. That's a lot of wood chip in the middle. And we just mix this up for initial start, let it cook for a month or two, and then come in with a final one additional mixing where we homogenize all the materials. But all the mineral amendments that we need in the field run through the digestion of, well, primarily the composting system. So when we need an actual mineral, we run it into the compost for better biological release and getting the materials on their way to being available to our field soil biology. Then the nitrogen source primarily comes from cattle manure from a local nearby grass-fed cattle farm. The cattle manure is from their winter feed pads, where they're feeding hay out on concrete pads, just out in the middle of some of these pastures. And so the cattle tend to congregate on the feed pad. They're eating all the hay. Obviously, they're throwing hay around. They stomp the hay down. And so it's cattle manure mixed with hay, essentially. And we start gathering that up come late winter, early spring. And actually on those piles, obviously the material is already heated quite a bit. It usually is maintaining quite a high temperature, 150 degrees on the pads or whatever. So it's a hot material and it's coming in. And we take that material and we bring it back to the farm. And that is probably maybe 20% of the pile. The sawdust vegetable scrap is probably another 20% of the pile. The final large amendment that we put in, I'm going to go back to manure in a second, but the final pile material that we put in, which makes up probably about 10% of the pile, and I think I got my numbers pretty close there, is to 100%, that is trap rock quarry dust from our local quarries, which is essentially just a rock that's underneath us. We've used granite as well. Basically, our rock in Connecticut is usually either trap rock or granite. I believe trap rock is a type of basalt. And so the quarries, they're in the business of grinding up the rock, into all different size materials. And what they're left with at the end of all this grinding procedure is this dust, which generally collects in their collection ponds and things like that. Then they dredge them out. Sometimes it's just right out of their machinery. But it's the rock dust that is left from stone grinding, stone crushing. And so that material, first of all, it's very inexpensive. It is, I think we were getting it from Tilcon at about $3 a ton. And the rest of all those materials are all free. The only expense I have for any of the compost materials is that I pay to truck them in instead of doing it myself. So we do have a cash outlay to bring the materials in. So the trap rock dust is the mineral component of the compost system. It resembles a clay-like material, and it gives the compost something mineral and clay-like intangible for the organic matter to build around. So instead of being, if there was no quarry dust in there, it would be all organic matter materials. The trap rock dust allows for a better, it's like using clay in your compost, which we actually have also used subsoil from our farm when we've dug out various projects and getting clay layers up, and we'll use subsoil as well for a similar procedure. But the trap rock, very, very useful for fresh mineral release. The quarry dust also has a fresh mineral component to it, which is that it is actually high in calcium and it is high in silica. So, and those materials, those minerals are really pretty useful in terms of when we want good crop growth in the field, disease resistance and bulking, and so calcium and silica are two of the real big ones. And by introducing a fresh trap rock dust as opposed to a clay, which might have some of those things bound to it and still be very useful, the fresh trap rock is giving us a fresh mineral influx of materials that, you know, for us to purchase calcium silicate is much more expensive than bringing in trap rock at $3 a ton. The fertilizer budget, including these materials, can be pretty high. You know, how high? 10 to 20% maybe in that range of your sales, because you're not, you know, there's a lot less investment in other things. So somewhere in that range. And so to get, you know, try to prioritize out of how much it costs, you know, obviously we are paying for trucking for any of these events. Well, the Asplund guys just bring it. So, and then there's other piles that other people have made, like some of the quarries have piled up an enormous wood chip and they sell it too. You know, obviously the regulators are working against us. The wood chip piles, which so many tree companies used to pile and sell, have been regulated by compost regulations and things like that, so they can't, so now the tree companies are just dispersing the wood chip on the spot, so, you know, a lot of regulation has gotten in the way. So, you know, there's those kind of scenarios, but tree cutting companies, some growers have had really good success getting personal contacts with tree cutting companies because it's different. The regulations in Connecticut, you know, I'm not a regulatory expert, but it's like small farm composting is tolerated essentially, and until you get up to a large scale level, and then it gets regulated and things like that. So tree companies will deal with small farms and deliver if they, you know, so you can set up with tree companies. Yeah, you're up against a biomass market. I don't know how that would work, but, you know, maybe you can pay something. And so that's the wood chip market in our area. The leaf, you know, we got a lot of lawn guys. You probably don't have that up here. Not so much. You know, I read, you know, in 5 Acres in Independence, you know, he was a proponent of leaf back 100 years ago, and he hired his guy to simply go out along the sides of the roads and just bring in leaves into his wagons and backhaul them. And so maybe it is worth, if there's a guy with a leaf sucker around that can just access leaves anywhere, you know, maybe it's worthwhile to pay him $50 or $100 a load or whatever to get that pile of leaf in. You know, it's something to work at. Certainly, we hire the straw guy. You could certainly take that method. You know, straw is probably the most expensive of all those options. Let's see, and so those are all your large-scale carbon sources. And, you know, there's always the forest itself, you know, in some way of being able to get the biomass yourself out of the forest. And, you know, so in cattle manure, you know, it just depends. You know, cattle farms like that, it's an amiable relationship. There's a lot of watermelons involved there as well. And we're saving him the labor simply of cleaning up his pads, and he doesn't really need that fertility off those pads back on his fields. It's a really expansive operation. And when he needs fertilizer, he brings in a chicken manure or something like that and spreads that instead of doing all this work piecemeal here and there a little bit. So he's more than willing to part with that just on an amiable level. Are we concerned about invasives in the materials? No, we've never experienced any kind of invasive weed in the wood chip or anything like that. Certainly, I discussed a little bit about the hay, bringing in hay materials or straw materials. Did I cover persistent herbicide in hay and straw? No. Okay, so hay and straw also you have to be very careful of. They're grown, sometimes hay and straw grasses are grown with herbicides of a class that do not decompose and readily at all. And so the stuff will come through in the hay and the straw and give you a low-level herbicide burn that it's very difficult to diagnose. So it is very important to know where your hay and straw are coming from to make sure there's been none of these persistent herbicides applied.
It could be in horse manure, too.
Yes, so getting to the next step is that it not only is it in the hay and straw, but DuPont and Dow make these materials, picloram, aminochloropleurid, some others, and like right on the side of the herbicide container, Dow states very clearly that the manure from animals that consume feeds grown with these herbicides should not be used in vegetable production, broadleaf. Because the manure from animals that eat those feeds will burn vegetable crops. Low level, hard to detect. So there's a huge contamination issue in manures and hay and straw. So you really got to pay attention to, and it is really difficult to know about animal feeds. Not only do, of course, they not break down in the animal digestive tract, but they actually don't break down readily in the compost pile either. Very, very slow to decompose. So even composting these materials is still a potentially hazardous situation. The bane and horrification of commercial composting are these materials. And they, obviously commercial composting, very popular in building, they still cannot get rid of these class of herbicides. They're too powerful and they're very ubiquitous, so it's difficult to avoid those materials. Let me get on to manure quality at this point, which is, I discussed cattle manure, grass-fed, obviously without those herbicides. So grass-fed cattle manure is about, the cream of the crop. The animals are extremely healthy. They're outside all the time. There's never veterinarians there. There's no antibiotics. There's no treatments for them, hardly at all. Maybe a little of this or that every once in a great while, or some, thing with hormone mating, or very, very low level of chemical residues in very healthy cattle. That is not the case so much in dairy farming. Dairy farming is in our area, especially conventional, which there's a lot of, even to some degree in the organic. The animals are being pushed for milk production, and they're being fed a lot of feeds and things that push the animals. The manure quality suffers from animals that are pushed, and so the cattle manure, top of the line. The cow, that manure, that whole digestive system is phenomenal for development of like the world's best fertilizer material. Legendary in its capacity to grow healthy crops, and it's the magical material. So that's the one to look for if it's available. Barring that, you can get into other animal manures. Obviously, chicken manure is very volatile and nitrogen rich, so you have to be very careful with that, and everything in between. We've used all kinds. Horse manure. Horses obviously are the most medicated animals out there and very hazardous with all the dewormers and antibiotics and all kinds of things that go into horses. So you have to be very cautious with contamination in horses. Also, the feeds are often, more towards a little too fussy with the feed, so they might contain more herbicide residues because of their fussiness, the use of herbicides to create that kind of a feed. So you got to really watch out for horse manure. Obviously not utilized very much, too hot, and can not really provide the nutrient and biology that you're looking for like you will with cattle. We do maintain a separate pile of really finished compost for special occasions as well, like potting soil and some other type of applications. So we do actually bring some compost all the way through into maturity. And so, yes, utilize the materials that you have available. Just do the best you can with them. The compost pile is the great cleanser and goes a long way towards decomposition of most of these chemical contaminants. And so, obviously, yes, diluting the horse manure with other more appropriate forms of manure and or carbon and or vegetables, just getting a bigger pile with a lower percentage of the horse manure in it. Yeah, getting into the differences between wood chips, wood shavings, and wood sawdust. So yeah, they're very different. And I started touching on that with the level they've been taken down the road of, the kiln-dried sawdust. Sometimes the shavings are coming from a similar situation, kind of depending, and then into wood chips. Wood chips, of course, most natural and most readily decomposed, especially the ramial, as I was talking about, the ends of the branches and things like that, as opposed to the trunks and things like that are going to be slower to decompose. So the shavings, we've certainly worked with shavings from bedding manure, from different dairies and things like that, and they do decompose. They don't quite give the loft of the wood chip, but they don't give the compact, more density of the sawdust. So they're kind of the intermediary. Some of the wood chips around us now, or wood shavings around us now, are ground up pellets, unfortunately. So I'm shying away from them unless I know that it's not coming from the pallet shaving factories that are in Connecticut, because of course pallets are loaded with contaminants. So there's that going on. And then the sawdust, which is really slow to break down, is because of that kiln-dried nature and the softwood nature of it, I would imagine, is the one that most needs to be made sure that there isn't too high of a percentage of it in the compost. And when you're spreading it on the field, if you hit pockets of sawdust, pitch them back in to the next rotation of the composting system, because too much sawdust on the surface of the soil can really get you into what I'm going to be talking about later, stunted growth instead of lushness. The carbon ratio of a sawdust, it just can really bump it up that way. Barring that, they're all useful materials, except for, obviously the loft of the wood chip with the aeration is very useful. If you're under an organic system, I'm sure it would be worthwhile going with the heating and bringing it up for that short amount, well, it's not that short, but that amount of time, and then cooling the pile off, and maybe even intentionally cooling it off, because maybe you could dilute it with more carbon or something like that, fresher materials, and bring it back down, and then get your fungal activity rolling at that point. Not ideal, more extra time, maybe not quite as good, but I'm sure it would still work well. Then, however, there is the alternative nitrogen source instead of use of manure, and that is a potential as well. So I'm not sure how the regulations work, but I think that if you didn't use manure, then you could be just using this low temperature compost pile, right, with an alternative nitrogen source. So you could look into alternative nitrogen sources, which around us, I'm not sure if this would fit into the same category or not, but we have a lot of fish down in Connecticut, and so there's a lot of fish carcass. And so we have certainly composted fish carcass compost, and so I'm not sure where that fits in terms of the regulations. It would be regulated? Yeah. Okay. And then there is fish fertilizer itself, which we have certainly made high carbon composts and heated the piles with a mixture of fish fertilizer and molasses as the means to heat the carbon up. So we've come in, obviously you got to purchase the fish fertilizer to do that. And so that might be another option. Or, there's other purchasable nitrogen inputs. I don't know where sodium nitrate falls. I've never been a big fan of sodium nitrate, but, possibly other nitrogen sources to purchase in if you're really just working with high carbon materials. Depending on your field situation, say you got enough field nitrogen, maybe you don't even need any nitrogen source beyond the leaf and whatnot, and you can go with a really cooler, just carbon pile like you're saying too. So all those things are worth trying to try to fit into your situation and experimenting with. Okay, so let's roll on. with assembly of the piles. So you can see here, the wood chip base that the trucks, were dump spreading materials. And you can see the minerals have gone on the backside there. There's more mineral application. There's our hired dump truck coming in on that fateful day I made that windrow. And that's cattle manure and hay coming out of the back of the truck, and then we just churn it up. It's landing on some wood chip, and then we're going to churn it up into the other materials. Like I said, I'm coming in with, say I laid down this much material, three scoops of the tractor. Then I'll come in with the appropriate portions of wood chip. I'll start piling them on top, and just a general churning with the tractor as I roughly assemble the initial pile. So that's just kind of like real rough, and then we're going to do another turn. There's the minerals going on. Now, that is how we throw the minerals onto the pile, which is to say, minerals are dusty and don't breathe them. So just be very careful. I had the mistake of, when I was younger, applying a lot of minerals directly to the field, and the dust would constantly kick up to me. I was careful when I applied them, but a lot of minerals were still on the surface of the soil, would constantly kick up as we cultivated or did other kind of field work, drove any kind of equipment over the field, constantly this mineral dust, and it really hurt my lungs. They were really clogged up and kind of painful for a while, like months, till I finally got that cleared out. Okay, so there's a lot of wood chip in the pile. This is just an example of, I think this is some of the raw materials. That's some of the leaf. And this is the quarry dust my daughter's standing on, which really looks like a blue stone-like material. And some aged sawdust on the side. We'll pile up sawdust and let it age before applying it to the pile. Sometimes, aging the sawdust actually helps out. Often we just throw it on there raw, but aging can really help out. And I believe that's just a picture of maybe getting into some subsoil there. Here's our loader tractor, the 240 International, which basically is the Super C made into an industrial tractor, so it has the same hitch system, same engine components and things like that. Okay, and this is, just as I was saying, this is compost more heading towards finishing for use in the potting soil. We do assemble specific composts, often by hand, but sometimes we'll do them by the tractor too, of the compost with mineral amendments in them for various crop growth periods. So this is the beginning of assembling a mineral-rich pile to aid in the flowering period of the crop. Okay, here's just that picture of the soil development. Here's that picture of the fungal activity in the field. Okay, and here is vermicomposting. And so we maintain a couple barrels for worm compost. And what that is primarily for is for liquid fertilizer material. And so what these barrels are is they're just barrels that had their top third of their side, or the top quarter of the barrel just sawed off. And there is about a maybe 3-inch hole, 2-inch hole drilled into the bottom of the barrel so that liquid can drain out of the barrel into those 5-gallon buckets. There's a screen across the bottom, a fine mesh screen. And so what we do is we feed the worm bins with half-decomposed vegetable matter. We often pull it right out of that sawdust vegetable scrap, because worms actually like half-decomposed instead of just feeding them fresh decomposed. But we pull kind of half-decomposed compost materials, and we feed them, or other specific things they might like they like corn cobs, things like that, in combination with any specific minerals that we might want to get into a liquid fertilizer. So in the case of these guys, they're getting calcium, because worms love calcium anyway, in a number of different forms: oyster shell, diatomaceous earth, are probably the prime ones, along with some trap rock dust, and some trace elements that we're looking for bioavailability and activity in the field, like boron and molybdenum. Boron and molybdenum are materials, that are hazardous in high volumes, but a little bit in there to keep them digesting and getting those into a readily bioavailable form is part of what's going on in that system right there. Now, the material is, so when we want a liquid carbon fertilizer, humic acid type fertilizer, we will pour water into the top of the bins and allow the leachate to come out the bottom of the bin. And so that takes, you pour the water in, if you to get it fully drained out, it probably takes about an hour. So before a liquid fertilizer event, I'm going to pour water in these things and get my liquid carbon material out. So essentially, that takes the place of purchased humic acid products in terms of the fertilizer liquids. So it's a homemade humic acid type fertilizer, greatly improved, I think, over commercial humic acid fertilizers.
What's in it? Just regular soil you get from your field?
Oh, in the actual bin, what are we feeding them? It's primarily, there is probably a little bit of soil in there. We've thrown some little bit of soil. It's primarily half decomposed vegetable scrap and things like that.
So that's the
Corn cobs, the bulk of the material is half decomposed compost material. Red wigglers, we did buy a special breed of vermicompost worms at one point, but in the end, we just captured a bunch of red wiggler compost worms and put them in the bin, and they work fine. We take the bins off the sawhorses, put them onto a cart, and wheel them into the root cellar in the winter. They are under a shade tree here. They get a lot of sun, but not full tilt sun on them. And the worm castings, essentially what happens in the bins is the worms move up into the fresh materials, and the underneath, it becomes like very rich worm casting like material, compost worm casting rich like material, very black. That material goes into the potting soil. So in the fall, when we're mixing our potting soils up, we skim off the top, all the red wigglers and the fresher materials. We take all the worm castings, we put them into a separate wheelbarrow or two, and then we put the worms back in the bin, give them fresh feed, and they're lighter then. We wheel them into the root cellar. And then the fresh vermicompost goes down into the potting soil formula, where we assemble the potting soil in the fall using a lot of the materials I'll be talking about in a minute. So, that's the vermicomposting. The liquid vermicompost is a carbon-rich buffer and biologically active, obviously. So liquid fertilizers, especially if you're working with salts and things like that, can be detrimental. But when you buffer them with a rich liquid carbon humic material like this, it will greatly lessen any kind of potential salt damage that you might introduce by a liquid salt fertilizer. In your handout, there's a lot of formulas. And so that material is used to essentially dilute a lot of the other side dress liquids, pre-plant liquid fertilizer, and that doesn't go into foliar. There's a different carbon, I'll be talking about that next, IMOs. So that material is used for a leaf growth mixture of 4 fluid ounces of a nitrogen source, homemade fish liquid, sodium nitrate, etc. We obviously use a homemade fish liquid. And actually, we rarely even use this formula because, as I said, we have a lot of nitrogen on the field. But occasionally, we have something that needs a liquid-rich nitrogen leaf material. 8 fluid ounces of molasses, 1/4 fluid ounce of Solubor, 1 fluid ounce of worm leachate, 8 fluid ounces of sea salt with water, so the mixture can cover 120 square feet. So that would be multiplied. Say we're doing 1,000 square feet or something, you'd be using just 10 fluid ounces of worm leachate there. So relatively small volumes. You know, in a pour, you know, for the pre-plant fertilizer, and you know, we might use maybe like 2 or 3 gallons into a 100-gallon tank. I don't think that specific formula is on there, but it might be. So just a few gallons to 100 gallons of water that then feeds into a dilution system of like 1 to 10 or something like that. So it is stretched, and it is not, we're not trying to deliver nutrients so much with that material. As I said, it's more like a buffering agent because we're using things like Solubor in those formulas, or which can be really hazardous, or sea salt. Yeah, it is really to bind and buffer. So essentially like a salt like Solubor in water is going to disassociate, and it allows the carbon chains of the fresh liquid humate from allow for a bonding sites for all these loose salts and things like that, which could be loose if you didn't add a buffering agent like a carbon source, and could potentially damage your soil life. So primarily it's a buffering agent, but it also is life-filled, and you know. This one says seawater, yes. So seawater is, yes, we go to the ocean and we backhaul lots of seawater. Seawater is one of our favorite fertilizers. We use it extensively in a lot of different recipes. Truly seawater, it's better than rehydrating sea salt. Now we use a lot of sodium sea salts in the compost, and we can't backhaul enough seawater to get enough sea salts into the composting system. So in that case, we use C90, which in a pinch, if we don't have available seawater for some of these formulas, we simply rehydrate the C90, which I believe it might be on the bag, but I think the ratio is 30 to 1. 30 parts water to 1 part salt in order to get it back to a seawater-like consistency. So you could use that. The benefit of seawater is that, you know, it's fresher and has actual sea biology in it as well as the sea mineral. And obviously, in our area, the Long Island Sound is polluted and contaminated, so we don't actually go to the south of Connecticut. We shoot over to Rhode Island, where it's a good open ocean area past Long Island, and not into Narragansett Bay, and we get a relatively clean seawater from those locations out there, is what we do. So I'm going to get more into these formulas and things like that. That's probably the worm bin right there. They also like coffee grounds, so we'll throw some coffee ground in there. Unfortunately, a lot of the trace elements that we need so desperately on our field, and I'm going to talk about that before, we're going to have a little break in a few minutes, but let me just finish with trace element dangers. Unfortunately, a lot of the specific trace elements which seem to be missing in our agricultural systems in the Northeast are the very hazardous ones. And so things that I see constantly needing to be added on farms around here are things like boron, and like I said, there's a molybdenum deficiency down our way. Cobalt has been deficient. Sulfur is often deficient. Potentially even copper, but really those other ones are probably the top most dangerous materials. And so I have seen Solubor, for instance. Legumes are hypersensitive to soluboron damage. And just the smallest amount of boron applied pre-plant to a legume crop can just make it look terrible, with like leaf scorching on the edges and things like that. Just so sensitive. And it's the same with the soil biology. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where often the most needed trace elements are the most hazardous ones. And so caution is definitely in order. There is almost excessive caution out there sometimes, but I certainly will definitely recommend being very cautious with any of those materials I just mentioned. And I think I've got them listed in here, which ones you need to be cautious with too. But the upside of all of that is that I was discussing vermicompost and the carbon chains in terms of a buffering agent. You are much less likely to run into damage from these kinds of trace element fertilizers if you have a very high organic matter, carbon level, and biological activity in your soil. In other words, it's much more hazardous to come in with salts, borons, like sodium itself, putting all that salt on land can be hazardous. But if the soil is in a high carbon level and you've got, running them through the digestive system of the compost first before putting them onto the biology of your field, or running them through the worm digestion, or combining them with the exudes of the worms, are the ways to keep those hazardous materials from damaging your soil biology. So really, it's better to build up your carbons, your soil life, and get your organic matter in place, and then start to amend with some of the traces. You can kind of get up higher levels, then to try to amend traces and hazardous materials before the field is in a high organic matter state. So this is just a quick picture of, I wanted to show you, since somebody might not know what a hydraulically mounted dump cart on a tractor looks like, but this is how we used to deliver compost or mulch materials even to the field. Simply had a cart mounted onto the tractor, weights on the front of the tractor, and you pull it out and hydraulically dump compost onto the field. Obviously, like I said, we use a manure spreader or pickup truck on the larger field spreading. I just want to cover quickly in the handout my crop rotation chart here. The home field is section 1 through section 4, and the rental field is the H sections there. So there's 16 sections on the home field, which are evenly divided into in other words, their space. I forgot exactly how many square feet each section is, but they're all equal. So that I know that this year we put 1B into garlic. When that rotates to the next section, it's going to be the same volume of garlic. So this crop rotation chart, not only does it let me know what crop goes where, it also tells me what volume the crop is. And so that interrelates to the marketing system. So I know that if I didn't have enough garlic last year, I have to increase the garlic in the rotation. And so this is both the marketing plan and the actual plant family rotation chart. Everything evenly divided in spaces. Let's take 1A, for example. So OW stands for overwintered. So in 1A, the lettuce and the dandelions came through the winter. That moves into, the slash is basically a solarization and turnover event. Slash means solarization, or if it's an off-season hoeing or whatever, to remove that crop. Generally, they're going to be mostly solarization events. So, right, lettuce and dandelion, spring, so say around May, beginning of June, mow the lettuce and dandelion down, and say some of the lettuces were finishing up earlier, or the dandelion was pulled and harvested, because we harvest the whole plants. What happens there is that just the dandelion gets solarized, and it moves into cilantro, which is cold hardy, as opposed to tomato or basil. Or maybe we do basil under a low tunnel and get it going really early. So this is it's flexible enough that I can start things earlier or later, but it's a general program, and it's not set in stone either. If I need more lettuce for salad greens and there's no area opened up where there was supposed to be lettuce, I simply put lettuce somewhere else. I used to rotate by plant family to avoid insects and disease, but I no longer have insects and disease to rotate away from. So it just freed me up to really put any plant anywhere I want at any time, but still, this is the marketing plan and general rotation principle in place. So solarizing event in early spring, say May, gets me into setting my tomato, basil, cilantro, and dill. Now tomatoes, like I showed you in the earlier pictures, are set every other bed, and the basil and the cilantro and the dill are going to be interseeded in between those beds. And then, of course, they might be timed, the basil and cilantro, maybe I need to get them in before the tomato transplants go in, or whatnot. Maybe some of this lettuce is going to be brought into a seed crop in between some of these tomato rows and actually go even longer. So there's some variability in it, but it's the general overall plan. So spring planted, tomato, basil, cilantro. And in the fall, September, end of the tomato season, mowed down into spinach and long season brassicas, which then in the next spring is going to move into cucumber. And so the general rotation plan down here tries to capture is 1A turns into 2B. And so except for the D sections, which are more on the field edges, rotate to themselves. So 1D becomes 2D, 2D becomes 3D, 4D becomes 1A. And that's the way the D sections rotate around because it's a shadier condition, and so they have shadier crop plan to the D sections. And then the Himmelsteins just goes from, the rotation is very simple. It's just 4 more or less quarter acre sections, one into the other, into the other. And, so there's an attempt to really capture what seeds go in where, at what time, in the constant flow of things. The 8 sections are showing the crimson clover interseeded and the partial garlic. So, for instance, this captures well that, the garlic was on H2 in the spring. In the fall, it's going to be planted into H3. So that's the way the rotation goes. So after the carrots come out, certain section of the carrots will turn into garlic. Only partial in the case of garlic. The rest of the section is in crimson clover. Obviously, to seed the garlic or plant the garlic, we wouldn't have laid the crimson clover and winter rye onto those specific beds, and likewise for the onion crop. Okay, so there's just, to get you guys in there with the crop rotation plan. We have found, as time goes on, that planting the same crop on top of the same crop can be quite effective. And there is this concept in soil biology that a growing crop has established the proper soil microbiology for that particular crop. So if you grew a really nice crop of lettuce, the soil is set up to grow lettuce, and you potentially, and we have certainly done this with success, mow off the lettuce and plant lettuce again. Now, that might not always be the case, but we've certainly had some success with it. Our marketing plan is, we have good steady sales, and part of establishing good, solid, steady summer sales is consistency and long availability. So by cropping year-round, not only do we capture the period of time when people are voraciously hungry in Connecticut, which starts to occur in September when all the universities reopen, everybody comes back from colleges, and everybody wants to start cooking. So the fall sales dramatically increase. And so that's why the root cellar, large amounts of root vegetables in the fall, combined with a lot of leafy greens, all that kind of thing, fall sales very, very high. And then overwintering the vegetables and keeping up a steady supply till, say, Christmas time, and then kind of letting go of steadiness for about a month, month and a half, till we get into about now in February, and then coming in with, again, very steady supply. So what I'm trying to describe is that you offer to, say, our food, we're the primary supplier to our local food cooperative, which is a relatively large food cooperative, and we offer them cilantro, say, 11 months out of the year. And so when all the other producers have cilantro in June, it doesn't really matter. They've been buying cilantro from us since February or March, and they're just going to carry through, and they're going to buy it all fall, all the way to Christmas time. And so you establish consistency in the marketplace with the wholesale accounts through a very long period, along with strong consistency. So the co-op, they want 160 bunches of cilantro a week. You better have 160 bunches of cilantro a week. Okay? They do not want to hear you got 100 and they got to go find some somewhere else. So consistency is very important to our marketing plan. And so in order to produce 160 bunches of cilantro a week, we have to grow 200 bunches of cilantro a week or whatever. So we have to overproduce in order to offer the consistency to the marketplace of the wholesale accounts. The overproduction that we take that we get from that primary route of sale is taken into direct sales in the farmers markets. So we mix the overproduction with just specific things that will only grow for farmers markets, for instance. And then we use those things to capture direct sales. So it's really the combination of the two which has proven to be a successful marketing avenue for us, wholesale and retail. It also allows us, the co-op has more, or the restaurants, they have more, like they want, say, the same size vegetable. Whereas, so you got undersized or oversized vegetable, you can bring those into direct sales in the farmer's market as well. So it allows us a little bit more flexibility in that, and the consistency and the very long season are very important to the actual capture of the summer marketing season as well. Traditionally, vegetables, like we're starting to reestablish a more natural system of marketing, but traditionally, like in French market gardening intensive days, what these people were talking about in France is that once cucumbers come in summer, they're worth nothing. But when you have cucumbers 2 weeks before season, or a month or 2 months before season, they're worth 20 times what the cucumber's worth when everybody has cucumbers.